Love in the Time of Capitalism is a Lever Hume funded project that launched in 2020 to 2021. I'm Julie Marie Strange, a modern historian at Durham University, and this project represents the outcome and development of 25 years of research into working class everyday life in Victorian and Edwardian Britain. This new project puts the emotional experience of being working class and knowing it at the centre of a story about making a class identity. That sense of being part of something bigger than yourself and belonging to a group with shared interests. Now, as historians, we know a great deal about working class institutions and the people that belong to them. Friendly societies, trade unions, miners' institutes, and so on. And these organisations are pivotal to a story about class. But they represent only a percentage of working people. There is some frustration among historians of class that as living standards improved during the 19th century, the political consciousness that generated movements like Chartism appear to give way to cultures of consumption and conservatism. The Salvation Army was founded by General William Booth in 1878. And it's not a kind of political movement as we would generally think of one. It's clearly Salvationist and it's imperial. But the Salvation Army recruited literally tens of thousands of working class followers. Even more men and women donated cash to support its welfare schemes, helping the homeless and the unemployed. The Salvation Army advanced critiques of capitalism. They were pioneers of consumer activism for working class consumers, and they pioneered a version of what we would call ethical capitalism, including in financial services. They ran their own bank and life insurance programs. But religion, spiritual life, and religious organisations like the Salvation Army and how they touched people's consciousness and their pockets are generally not included in stories of class. When we integrate organisations like this into a story of class, the scope for seeing political consciousness becomes suddenly much greater. During the 19th century, as Britain's colonial and economic reach expanded across the globe, many more people came to Britain to make it their home. Some, for example sailors, Yemeni sailors, came and were transient, while others married British working class women and stayed permanently. This project then takes a much more elastic conception of who was working class and what it meant to be working class and know it in order to understand how a politicised working class culture is made.
A few years ago, my wife and I had an interesting conversation with a friend of ours who was an artist in Canada. We were discussing the motivations for her work on lichens, which was fascinating. She told us that the motivation emerged from a moment in which she was hiking up a trail in the Canadian Rockies, and suddenly she came upon an opening in which she could see the vast expanse of the mountains, the plains and valleys below with the meandering rivers. We thought that sublime vista was what every hiker seeks, the overwhelming sense of taking in the panoramic landscape. Yet our friend Rhonda did something very different and quite radical in my opinion. Instead of taking in the landscape and the vistas, she decided to look down on the ground, to the stones and undergrowth that she found there. And it was there that she saw lichens in beautiful patterns attached to rocks. My research draws from that awareness of the power of sublime panoramic vistas in making invisible those other things strewn across the ground. My friend's artistic gesture reveals how the representation of landscape is complicit with specific modes of knowledge production, which in the Americas are often linked with settler imaginaries that favor describing those lands as vacant and empty plains. Spurred on by my research, I traveled extensively to see for myself the very many different plains of South America. From the Pampas to the Andean High Plains to the Pantanal wetlands, my research has sought to describe what I term as the dominant imaginaries of the plains. You see, the repetition of certain portrayals of nature in the Americas tends to enact the settler experience of arriving and not having the conceptual tools to understand these seemingly new environments. I say seemingly new because indigenous communities had long ago inhabited those lands, only to be forcefully displaced by settlers, along with those modes of knowing and interacting with the land. My work has identified a series of recurrent representations of the plains in Latin American canonical literature. The plains as empty deserts, the plains as ruined lands, the plains as sites of predation and ferality. Beyond canonical literature, these representations of plains geographies can be found in different media to this very day. For example, the recent remake of the science fiction film Mad Max, with its vast empty deserts that are plains. These are very, very powerful images that continue to captivate us nowadays. And it is in that sense that they are dominant. They efface other possible ways of imagining and knowing those lands. To engage with the current climate crisis is to also consider how our dominant imaginaries of nature validate certain practices throughout the world, from intense monoculture to resource extractivism. Identifying such representations is a means of generating interstices through which to allow other modes of knowing and inhabiting the planet. And not unlike the gesture implicit in my friend's engagement with lichens, my work continues to shift our attention towards other ways of seeing and imagining the world around us.
I'm Naomi Booth and I teach in the English Studies department here at Durham, and I am particularly interested both in my teaching and my research in creative response alongside literary analysis. One of my interests as both a writer and an academic researcher is the relationship between environments and human bodies and the literary depictions of those relationships, and literary ecologies is how I think of those relationships. And I've become increasingly interested in the relationships between specific geographical regions and the literatures that they produce. So I was really delighted last year to have the chance to become involved in a project called HAG, which was all about revitalising regional folk tales, going back to the regions that they were originally told in and inviting contemporary writers to produce contemporary versions of certain folk tales that were at risk of going extinct. HAG was originally commissioned by Audible. So there was a sense in which those of us who were involved were attempting to make a contribution to a very new oral storytelling tradition which has sprung up recently through the popularity of podcasts and audiobooks and all sorts of audio drama series. So it was really interesting to work on older materials but using very modern technology. So my piece, for example, which is called Sour Hall, used binaural sound, so there was a real sense of the listener being in the middle of the action. And I suppose it's interesting to think about the power of those oral traditions as we maybe enter a new golden age of oral storytelling that's been facilitated through new technologies. It seems to me to be a really good and interesting time to be thinking about regional traditions of storytelling, partly because I think there's been a real proliferation in the last couple of decades in modes of production that are based in the regions, by which I mean a kind of proliferation of independent small publishers, many of which are based in the north as well as in other regions in Britain and Ireland. And it really feels like there's a groundswell of excitement about both writers and publishers and other artists who are based outside of London at the moment. My own work is published by Dead Ink, a publisher in Liverpool, which is part of the Northern Fiction Alliance. And they're a group of publishers based in the north of England who are really interested in diverse storytelling and disseminating stories from different parts of the UK.
I'm Professor of Classics in the Department of Classics in Ancient History at Durham, and I specialise in the Latin literature of the late Republic and early Empire. And for the past decade or so, I've been working on a Latin writer called Pliny the Younger. He's probably best known for his eyewitness account of the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE. Pliny was a senator and consul under Trajan, and during his own lifetime published a collection of roughly 400 of his own letters. And last year I published a biography based on those letters called Man of High Empire, The Life of Pliny the Younger. In this biography, I was trying to solve a problem. How do you write the biography of someone from a society that doesn't share our modern ideas of selfhood and individuality? The idea of the validity of the unique individual simply didn't exist. The question rather was, how far did this person conform to and exemplify and express shared communal values? Pliny's contemporaries also knew all about the inner life, so beloved of modern biography, but they just didn't think it was either very interesting or even very revealing. What they preferred to ask was, how far can you control your inner life to conform to universal moral standards? So the question then becomes how to write the biography of someone from a society that isn't particularly interested in the unique individual and how we understand it, or indeed in the rich inner life. Then, as a solution to that problem, I reflected on the fact that ancient culture has other ways of external ways of getting to grips with individuality. In the Odyssey, for example, it is important that Odysseus is from Ithaca, a small, rocky, remote island that somehow affirms the impress of the individuality of Odysseus. And that gave me the key to unlocking Pliny's letters as a source for framing and understanding Pliny's individuality in a way that I thought was more authentic in regards to his ancient culture. His letters are in fact very rich in detail about the places where he was born and the places where he lived as an adult. Pliny is in fact probably Latin literature's greatest writer of the Italian countryside, better in his way even than Virgil. He tells us all about Comum, where he was born, about Umbria, where he owned a luxury villa and farm, about the Laurentine shore near Rome, where he owned a villa to get away from his busy life as senator and courtroom orator in Rome, and about Campania, where he witnessed the eruption of Vesuvius in 79, and Pontus Bithynia, where he was governor under Trajan and met a community of Christians there. It's another thing for which he is quite famous. So writing about Pliny's life in each of these locales allowed me to really bring out something of the uniqueness of Pliny's life without being untrue to ancient ideas of the individual. And also took inspiration from the fact that a similar approach actually has been used and worked in modern biography. Hermione Lee's biography of Virginia Woolf, for example, talks a lot about the houses where Virginia Woolf lived as a way of getting at her individuality. My hope is this biography will make a difference to how people write biographies of ancient figures in the future. Think hard about the difference between our ideas of selfhood and individuality and ancient ideas, and how we can write their stories in a way that is true to their ancient culture without imposing modern biographical categories on ancient individuals. So, where to next after this? Well, having spent a few years on just one letter writer, my ambition is to take on all ancient letter collections before the year 410 in conjunction with my friends and colleagues Andrew Morrison and Antonia Sari. And we basically, if you ask many professional classes how many ancient letter collections survived from the year before, year 410, they wouldn't know. The answer is 50, but 30 Greek, 20 Latin, and there's thousands and thousands of letters, but it's not a subject that is often studied with a sense of the overview, because simply people don't know what's there. So in a book of about 250,000 words, we're going to survey all of these ancient letter collections and bring them together as a kind of canon, including the letters of the New Testament. It's a pan-Mediterranean letter collection in that study in that regard.
Give a thought to Africa 'neath the burning sun. I'm Erin Johnson-Williams, a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in the Department of Music. Broadly speaking, my research focuses on systems of musical power and how British imperialism impacted systems of musical education in the late 19th century. So an example of this can be found in the article I recently had published in the Journal of the Royal Musical Association. In this piece of writing, my starting point was asking the question, what systems of musical power were at place in shaping institutions of musical education in both late 19th century South Africa and Britain? Another starting question was, how do imperial musical practices from the 19th century play out in systems of musical education that are still in place today, both in Britain and the post-colonial world? This is particularly important in light of conversations in 2020 and 2021 in light of Black Lives Matter and decolonization. So my starting point when I approached the history of the ABRSM was looking at their first examining tour abroad in 1894 to colonial South Africa, starting in Cape Town. The newspapers at the time, such as the Musical News, published the minutes of the ABRSM annual dinner in July 1894, at which Sir George Grove, the president at the time, rose to give a toast to Franklin Taylor, who I call in the article the Examiner, who says he will forsake his chair for several months to go and examine the black man. Now, this was an ironic comment at the time, given that in his first examining tour of over 200 candidates, all of them were white. So one thing I did was I started to look at this examining tour and ask myself what musical practices were actually happening on the ground in 19th century South Africa in terms of how British colonialism was actually affecting musical practice at large. And what I found was that while these examining tours of the ABRSM, which was extremely, had a lot of financial and cultural capital at the time, while those were being publicized widely in the British musical press, a lot of the actual work of British musical colonialism that was happening on the ground had to do in the churches, had to do with what I call missionary imperialism, and had to do with the wide circulation of hymns in what was called tonic solfa notation, which was a different kind of musical notation, and you'll see this in the example I provide here. This was a notation that had been used in 19th century Britain for a lot of working class education and a lot of nonconformist hymn services. What I found when looking at 19th century South Africa was that the hymns in tonic solfa notation were by far more prevalent and long-lasting in terms of the actual permeability of colonial musical education than the sort of elite systems of the ABRSM. So what I did in terms of tracing a sort of movements of musical colonialism at this time was I found that in 1894, as Franklin Taylor was sent out from the ABRSM on a ship to Cape Town, that very year, a black Xhosa composer, John Knox Bokwe, who was a nonconformist minister and a composer of many hymns in his native language as well as in English, was publishing several hymn books in Xhosa notation at the time, and was using those hymns as a way to also travel back to Britain, where his hymns were widely sung to concert audiences in Britain at the time by the South African Choir, which is a choir of black South Africans that toured 19th century Britain. And what I found was, when looking at these stories in 1894 of Franklin Taylor, the musical examiner, traveling to colonial South Africa, and John Knox Bokwe, the musical evangelist, traveling from South Africa to Britain, is that of the two systems of musical education, the nonconformist hymn offered perhaps the more flexible navigation of resistance and aesthetic incorporation of empire than the sort of elite financial structure of the ABRSM, which gave me, in light of triangulating this within post-colonial and decolonial studies, a way to navigate how systems of imperialism that tended to play out in nonconformist structures rather than secular ones have offered South Africa long-lasting ways to negotiate a post-colonial musicality.
I work in the areas of modern Catholic theology and systematic theology, and I've been asked to say a little bit about a book I recently published called God, Evil, and the Limits of Theology. Over the years, like many academics, I've quite often been asked to speak about things which were not my main project at the time. And I've seen these papers and articles as a kind of guilty distraction, slowing down whatever I was supposed to do, distracting me from my main core research. What I eventually realized, though, is that whatever particular topic I was asked to talk about, and did talk about, I nevertheless came back to a certain set of preoccupations. I was circling around the same issue. Questions about the nature of mystery and paradox in theology, questions of the limits of what can be thought. And so this book, God, Evil, and the Limits of Theology, has emerged out of what I originally thought of as these many distractions to my real work. And now that it's published and I'm beginning to get a bit of a response to it, I've started to think that perhaps I should think of it not as the book of distractions, but as the central piece of work I've been doing all along. I want to say a little bit about one essay in the volume, which has a particularly strong link to my ongoing research. This essay is called Julian of Norwich, Hans Urs von Balthasar, and the Status of Suffering in Christian Theology. Julian of Norwich was an anchorite, a mystic and theologian in the 14th and 15th century, so roughly contemporaneous with Chaucer. And as far as we know, she's the first woman to have written in English. Hans Urs von Balthasar was a 20th century Swiss-German Catholic theologian, very voluminous writer, very literary in an inclination. So they're an unusual pair to bring together. And in one sense, the only reason that I've done it is that I happened to be teaching on Julian year after year at the same time as I was writing a book on Hans Urs von Balthasar. And I began to notice that each of them was deeply preoccupied by suffering. And at the same time, there was quite a sharp and striking contrast between the basic patterns of their thought. So in this essay, I propose that we can find in them two templates, two fundamentally different ways within a Christian context of relating love and suffering. On the one hand, in Balthasar's thought, there's always a merging of love and suffering, so that mention of suffering always carries overtones of sort of positive spiritual overtones, and love is almost never mentioned without suffering or sacrifice or loss of self being somewhere nearby. And in Julian, by contrast, even though she has such a fascination with suffering that it can be quite troubling to modern readers, she ultimately holds love and suffering apart. And that's allied to a fundamentally more positive sensibility that runs through her work. An interesting thing is this means in the case of Julian that there's a refusal of intellectual resolution at the core of her theology. There's a limit to how far explanation can go for her. While Balthasar does offer his readers a unifying, integrating vision in which he can give account of how all things, including suffering and evil, fit together. This essay was my first stab at thinking about the status of suffering in Christian thought. It's an area that I continue to work on, and one that I constantly sense is on the edge of being just impossibly large and impossibly amorphous, but at the same time where I keep catching a glimpse of something quite important, which I think can and should be said.
I ended up writing a popular article for The Conversation, which is an online magazine. Quite a short article, really. It was about examples of scientists being misled in the history of science. But I wasn't trying to say that we shouldn't trust science or something. I was just saying these examples are actually quite rare. But scientists are occasionally misled by the evidence. So this was picked up by somebody at NASA Goddard, surprisingly, who had been casting around on the internet looking for somebody who maybe had a different way of looking at things. And they were curious about the possibility that they were being misled by evidence in exoplanet science, generally speaking. So maybe we're looking at the wrong planets to find life, for example, or maybe what looks like a biosignature isn't a biosignature, or what looks like it isn't life, it is life, or something like that. So could they be being misled? And so they read this article and they ended up inviting me out there to NASA Goddard, and I gave this talk. So this led to me writing an article in the International Journal of Astrobiology called Expecting the Unexpected in the Search for Extraterrestrial Life, where I explore ways in which we might go about identifying unexpected phenomena or not missing things. Scientists always have their biases. Everybody has their biases in pursuing things. If you expect certain things, then you're going to have certain strategies designed around those expectations. But sometimes those biases lead you astray. So this article is exploring ways in which you might avoid that. And one way is perhaps to have a balanced portfolio of projects in the scientific community. So the majority of your projects are going to be what you might call low-risk projects, sometimes called low-risk, low-reward. You know the project's going to succeed. It's not trying to do anything groundbreaking, but it's going to make an incremental change in our pursuit of knowledge. Then you've got high risk, high reward at the other end. And these are the projects you do expect to fail. But you want to make sure you're funding a certain number of these. One of the problems there is that because you expect most of them to fail, that looks bad when they've been to the funder perhaps, when they've been funded and then they fail. And somebody somewhere will say, why didn't you fund my project? My project was a sure thing. It was going to go somewhere interesting. But you funded this project and it failed. And what the funder would say is, well, I want to fund maybe 10 of these, and only one will succeed, but then it will give us these high rewards. This is sort of the balanced portfolio idea that you put most of your funding into safe projects, but you do want to put some funding into the high-risk projects. And maybe you want some in between as well, which is sort of medium risk, medium reward. So some funders are exploring this idea that they're going to pursue this balanced portfolio, and that might actually change the way in which some of these funders approach funding scientific projects. It's not just about the project in front of you for the funder. It's about funding this portfolio. So these ideas brought me into contact with the UK Centre for Astrobiology up in Edinburgh, and I gave a talk up there, and several of the scientists there wanted to then collaborate on a bigger project, which is looking at exploring high-risk strategies in contemporary astrobiology. So we've just put in a proposal for a big project to one of the funders, and we're waiting to hear back on whether that will be successful. So fingers crossed.
(1967). 7 years after Nigeria gains its independence from Britain, the young nation finds itself in a state of crisis. Igbo people living in northern Nigeria are massacred and their property destroyed. Those who survived fled to their hometowns in Nigeria's eastern region. When negotiations between the East and Nigeria's military government fail, the eastern region declares its independence and the nation of Biafra is born. A war breaks out, lasting almost 3 years, during which time millions of Biafrans die as a result of military attack, starvation, and disease.
I've been interested in how to bring this conversation into a broader public sphere, because one of the things that's striking about the Nigeria-Biafra War is that whilst it's probably the most tumultuous and sort of path-changing period of Nigeria's history, within the context of the nation, there hasn't been public conversations about the war. And so my interest was, how do I help to facilitate this public conversation? Now, my research is in literary studies, and so primarily my approach has been thinking about the literature of the war and literature as a site of memory. And my work is interested more in what Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie describes as emotional truth. So thinking through the human impact of the war, how did it affect individuals? How did it affect communities? And what are the legacies of the war? And so I collaborated with the Nigeria Art Society UK to stage the Legacies of Biafra exhibition. So we held a show at the Brunei Gallery at SOAS from January to March 2018. And one thing that struck me so much in both the exhibition, but just in the larger project I've been working on, which has included staging an international conference, also making a documentary film, is that how important these spaces are. As I said, there hasn't really been public space for this conversation. In the wake of the war, when Biafra fell, the focus was on rebuilding, the focus was on moving on. And so individuals and communities haven't really had the space to breathe, to commemorate, to reflect. Having this, exhibition, the focal point being the artwork, some parents were able to broach the subject. And I'm thinking about one family in which, looking at one of the pieces by Chike Azonye, Exodus, which depicts the sort of movement of people, the refugees who were, people who'd lost their homes and livelihoods and were now trekking by foot to try and find, shelter, find somewhere to stay. And I should say that was Chike's own story as one of the artists who actually experienced the war firsthand. But having that space to talk through their own experiences about displacement, about loss, the trauma, but actually being able to refer to the painting and not have the spotlight on them, so to speak, was a way of broaching the conversation. So the next installation of the exhibition, Legacies of Biafra, will be at Gallery Oldham, but it's due to run from October 2021 to February 2022. And in my own research, it's really been a privilege and an honor to be able to have these conversations, to be able to hear from survivors and from those who were deeply affected by the war, and to be able to really have that space for a conversation. And that's been an important thing for me.
In addition to my normal academic work, I also had a sideline as a computer programmer. And ever since I was in graduate school, I have been developing and enhancing software that enables people to read databases of Latin and Greek texts, along with dictionaries and other sort of helps for reading. And so this is a project I call Diogenes, named after the Greek philosopher who scorned worldly possessions, because when the time was that I started on this project, all of the alternatives were commercial software offerings, and this is free open source software. And so all of those commercial offerings have, as they tend to do, fallen by the wayside. They're no longer supported, no longer available. And so my software is pretty much the only game in town. And the databases it works with are still the most comprehensive downloadable databases of classical Latin and ancient Greek texts. So this project started as something that I did just to support my own research as a graduate student. I then published it on the internet for weirdos and computer geeks, that very small intersection of the Venn diagram of people who are interested in Latin and Greek and people who are computer geeks. But as time went on and as other software fell by the wayside, I had lots of requests from other people saying, could you make the software work on a Mac and work on Windows? And so over the years I've done that, and I now support all of those different platforms, which is a lot of work for one person, because quite a lot of commercial software development houses will only support one platform and not multiple. So this is something that I've been doing for a long time, and I find it extremely rewarding, because with academic research, you're writing for a very narrow audience, but with this, I get emails from all over the world. Especially gratifying when I get emails from places like Latin America and China, from people who say that they have no access to any good libraries or dictionaries or classical texts, and this is their only way of reading widely in classical literature. So that's been incredibly valuable to me in terms of just having some connection with the world outside of the classroom and outside of my narrow subspecialism. And so I'm actually quite grateful to the impact agenda for having made room for this kind of work in my job. And so I'm very pleased to have put forward Diogenes as an impact case study for my department in the current ref.
I've been co-investigator on the Hearing the Voice project, which is funded by the Wellcome Trust and has been ongoing since 2012. We're delighted that the project has been recognised by the 2020 Medical Humanities Award from the AHRC and the Wellcome Trust for Best Research. My role has been to investigate literary studies and what literary studies can bring to our understanding of voice hearing. And particularly the pre-modern texts that I work on can really illuminate contemporary experience by offering new frameworks for understanding and authorization. And the pre-Cartesian thought world of the Middle Ages is of particular interest because it assumes a Christian framework of God, the devil, the spirit world in between. Voices and visionary experience are understood as arising from traumatic experience, but also from supernatural influence. And they can be transformative, and they can lead to some of the most influential, creative, enduring literary texts.
I share some of Corian's interests in the hearing voice studies on Julian of Norwich and Marjorie Kemp, both of whom are fascinating characters, not only because of their place in history as respectively the first woman to write an autobiography in the English language and the earliest book we have written by a woman in English, but because of the way in which they reflected spiritually upon their lives and times, upon their illnesses and their experiences of marriage, family, and life in church and society. So Marjorie and Julian have their parallels in contemporary church and society, and in a recent survey published in BMJ Medical Humanities, we asked people about their experiences of hearing voices that for them were spiritually significant. We found some interesting continuities and discontinuities with other kinds of voice hearing experience. So for example, in some ways these experiences were similar to those encountered in the course of major mental illness. In other ways they were experiences similar to those of people in the Hearing the Voices network or others who hear voices in the absence of a psychiatric diagnosis. But in other ways, they were quite unique. Particularly, they occurred commonly in prayer. They were not perceived as negative or unpleasant or distressing experiences. They were something that was enriching, life-giving and meaningful. The voices, in a way, were indifferently for different people, a process of finding meaning in terms of relationship with God today, rather similar to Julian and Marjorie, but updated, as it were.
In 1823, a young boy in upstate New York was awoken in the middle of the night by an angel in his bedroom. This angel, as he would tell it later, was speaking to him about the location of a buried text. And this text that young Joseph Smith would produce to the world was the Book of Mormon. I'm Adam Powell. I'm a research associate in medical humanities and religion, based both in the Institute for Medical Humanities and the Theology and Religion department. And when I joined Hearing the Voice during its second phase in 2016, I really wanted to take these sorts of historical accounts from the 19th century and put them into dialogue with the existing research that the project was producing, both on sort of medieval accounts of religious experiences and hearing God's voice, but also contemporary accounts. So in addition to work on 19th century Mormonism, I ended up contributing to some collaborations with psychologists on the project, looking at another religious movement that was also founded in the same time and place as Mormonism, and that's what we call spiritualism. And spiritualism afforded us the opportunity to look at contemporary accounts of hearing spiritual voices, because spiritualist mediums report weekly, if not daily, voices. And these are ostensibly the voices of the dead, communicating with them. So I ended up collaborating with a cognitive psychologist on the team to design a survey of British spiritualists. And some of these findings, for instance, that spiritualists report voice hearing very early on in childhood, as well as the fact that they seem to be prone to imaginative experiences as well as auditory hallucinations, were picked up by news outlets across 29 different countries. And eventually our findings were published in several different languages. This resulted in, for instance, an article in Forbes, as well as an interview in BBC Science Focus magazine.